I never thought a small, friendly neighborhood could feel like a battlefield, until HOA Karen knocked on my door. In less than a minute, she was handing me a stack of fines, threatening lawsuits, and declaring I had no right to live on my own property. Every rule she cited seemed made up on the spot, every demand more absurd than the last. I could feel her power pressing down on me, but I refused to back down. And then, something happened in just 3 minutes that completely turned the tables. How did I go from being trapped under her control to legally dissolving her authority? I had always thought of our little cul-de-sac as the perfect place to call home. Quiet streets lined with maple trees, neighbors who waved as they walked their dogs, and a sense of safety that made evenings feel warm and calm. My home wasn't just a house. It was the place where weekends were spent barbecuing in the backyard, mornings sipping coffee on the porch, and nights watching the stars with my kids. Life was simple, predictable, and exactly the way I wanted it. I'd even grown fond of the HOA, or at least I thought I had. Their emails about community events and seasonal guidelines seemed harmless at first, just another layer of neighborly oversight. Sure, there were rules about fence heights and paint colors, but who cared? I had always followed them, believing the association existed to keep the neighborhood pleasant, not suffocating. Yet, lurking beneath the polished lawns and friendly smiles, there was a rigid control I hadn't noticed, a shadow of petty authority waiting for the smallest slip to pounce. A neighbor, or maybe it was the HOA itself, had already started watching me more closely than anyone should. Little things I once ignored now felt like traps. A sideways glance over a garden wall, a subtle remark about my property, a file left in my mailbox that hinted at someone keeping score. I didn't know it yet, but the peace I'd taken for granted was about to shatter. One seemingly minor infraction, one decision to live my life the way I wanted, would set off a chain of events I couldn't have imagined and would put me directly in the crosshairs of someone who thrived on control, rules, and revenge. At first, the fines were almost laughable. A few dollars here, a gentle reminder there. I received a letter claiming my mailbox was too worn, another insisting my lawn wasn't trimmed according to community standards. I stared at them, incredulous. My mailbox had been standing for decades, and my lawn, perfectly green just as it had always been. But when HOA Karen, or her proxies, set their sights on you, perfection is never enough. It didn't take long for the petty harassment to escalate. A neighbor who had once been friendly started showing up at random times, taking notes in her little notebook whenever I mowed the lawn or parked my car. Packages went missing in the community area, only to reappear with notes about their placement violating HOA rules. Even the playground my kids loved became a minefield, with warnings posted for swings that were somehow non-compliant. Each day brought a new confrontation. I was fined for a garden decoration, for leaving my recycling bin out for an hour too long, for a bird feeder that someone said blocked the sidewalk view. Emails piled up in my inbox, each one more absurd than the last. Their language was formal, intimidating, but the absurdity was unmistakable. I started keeping a file of every notice, every fine, every passive-aggressive comment, not knowing how it might help me later, but feeling deep down that something had to be done. The real turning point came the morning I received an official notice claiming I had violated a rule that didn't even exist in the HOA handbook. They demanded I remove an entirely legal structure from my property within 24 hours or face escalating fines. My heart sank. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about control, about making me feel small, helpless, trapped in my own home. I tried reasoning with them at first. Emails, calls, polite explanations. Surely there's been a mistake, I thought. But every attempt at dialogue was met with silence, or worse, veiled threats. The more I stood my ground, the more aggressive the fines became. Late fees piled up like bricks, and suddenly, what started as petty harassment felt like a financial siege. Neighbors began whispering too. I could feel the tension in the air whenever I stepped outside. Old friends avoided me, unsure which side of the HOA lines they were supposed to stand on. Even casual gatherings felt charged, like walking into a courtroom. The psychological weight was immense. My evenings, once full of laughter, were now spent poring over HOA documents, rereading every clause, every bylaw, looking for a loophole, any hint of protection. Then came the inspection notices. Every week, someone from the HOA, or claiming to be from the HOA, was at my property, clipboard in hand, scrutinizing everything, paint color, fence alignment, even the number of garden gnomes I had. One day, they accused me of altering the landscape without approval, even though I hadn't touched a single blade of grass. I wanted to scream, but I forced myself to stay calm. Every interaction was being logged. Every fine, every violation was evidence of their overreach. As the days turned into weeks, I realized this wasn't just harassment, it was a test of will. I could either give in, pay the fines, and let them win, or I could fight. But fighting meant more than standing my ground. It meant learning their rules inside out, tracking every misstep, documenting every overreach, and preparing for a confrontation I had no guarantee of winning. And then came the neighbors. Some silently sided with me, offering quiet words of encouragement over fences or in driveways. Others reported me to the HOA for the smallest infractions, likely egged on by Karen herself. The tension in the community became palpable, like electricity before a storm. Simple things, like taking out the trash or parking in my own driveway, now felt like acts of defiance. Every day, the sense of being watched, judged, and manipulated grew heavier. At night, I would replay each interaction in my mind, dissecting the language, the tone, the timing. I realized Karen wasn't enforcing rules to maintain order. She was asserting dominance. Every notice was a power move. Every fine, a reminder that she could dictate what I did on my own land. My frustration grew, but so did my determination. I wasn't going to let fear dictate my life. Not in my own home. The first glimmer of a plan appeared one morning when I noticed a procedural error in one of their letters. A missing signature. A clause that didn't apply to my property type. A tiny loophole in their otherwise ironclad language. My heart raced. This wasn't just luck. It was an opening. I began compiling every misstep, every document, every recorded violation of their own rules. I created a timeline, noting dates, times, and actions, building the foundation for what I hoped would be the turning point. But just as things seemed like they might shift, Karen escalated again. A formal complaint appeared on my doorstep, claiming I had interfered with HOA business by asking neighbors to question her authority. Suddenly, I wasn't just defending my property, I was accused of threatening the entire system she had built. The absurdity was maddening. I laughed through my frustration at first, incredulous that someone could take petty control so seriously. But deep down, I knew this was my moment. This was the build-up to the confrontation I'd been bracing for. Each morning felt like a countdown. Would I receive another fine, another warning, another impossible demand? Or would I finally have the leverage I needed to turn the tables? The tension was unbearable, yet exhilarating. Every step I took on my property became a calculated risk. Every interaction was a test of nerves. And then came the day when the stakes became higher than ever. The day I realized Karen had overstepped in a way that could not be ignored. A misstep so glaring that it would give me the upper hand, if I played it right. Little did Karen know, her obsession with rules, her need to control, had blinded her to the very law that could undo her authority. And at that moment, the entire dynamic of our little neighborhood began to shift. The morning of the confrontation arrived with a quiet intensity, almost as if the neighborhood itself knew something monumental was about to happen. I could feel it in the air, the way the sunlight hit the tree-lined streets, casting long shadows across lawns. Everything seemed ordinary, yet beneath the surface, tension coiled like a spring ready to snap. Today wasn't about petty fines or vague threats. Today was the culmination of weeks, months, of harassment, intimidation, and absurd power plays. And I was finally ready to fight back. The first knock on my door came sharp and deliberate. Karen stood there, clipboard in hand, eyes glinting with the smug satisfaction of someone convinced they hold absolute authority. Her aura was as suffocating as ever. "We need to discuss your violations," she said, voice calm but edged with menace. I invited her in, the air between us charged with a mix of fury and anticipation. I had meticulously prepared for this moment, armed with evidence, timelines, and legal references she couldn't ignore. But as I looked at her face, I realized something crucial. Karen thrived on control, and nothing I could say would shake her confidence, unless I revealed the truth in a way that left no room for denial. I laid out the stack of documents I had compiled. Every illegal fine, every procedural error, every contradictory clause she had tried to enforce. I spoke deliberately, calmly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. These aren't just mistakes, I said. They're systematic attempts to control me, to enforce rules selectively, and to intimidate a homeowner for your personal satisfaction. And every single one of them is legally unenforceable. Karen's eyes flicked across the pages, a flash of irritation betraying the composed mask she wore. I pressed on, pointing out every oversight. Missing signatures, misapplied bylaws, deadlines ignored, and even evidence of favoritism toward certain neighbors. The room felt electric. I could almost hear the tension stretching taut between us. Then, the moment I had been building toward, I revealed a clause buried deep in the HOA's governing documents, a clause Karen had either overlooked or willfully misinterpreted. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that homeowners retained ultimate authority over their property and could challenge the HOA's decisions through a formal legal dissolution process. I leaned back, letting the words settle in. Her smugness wavered ever so slightly. This was the leverage I had been waiting for, the crack in her armor that would allow me to shift the balance of power entirely. Karen attempted to counter, her voice rising. She cited more rules, more fines, more imagined infractions. But I was prepared. Every claim she made had already been disproven, cross-referenced, and documented. My calm, methodical responses began to chip away at her confidence piece by piece. I could see the subtle signs. Her gestures became more agitated, her tone edged with frustration, and her eyes darted nervously to the papers in my hands. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that the very authority she had wielded like a weapon could be challenged, and that I had the power to do it legally. The confrontation escalated further when neighbors, curious and concerned, began appearing outside my windows. Some whispered words of support. Others watched silently, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. Karen's control over the narrative, over the perception of who held power in the community, was slipping right before her eyes. It was almost cinematic, the predator realizing the tables had turned. I could feel the energy shift, the room charged not just with my own determination, but with the collective tension of everyone who had witnessed or endured her petty tyranny. In a final, dramatic move, I invoked the legal clause that allowed homeowners to petition for the dissolution of the HOA under circumstances of repeated overreach or abuse of authority. I laid out the procedure in painstaking detail, explaining exactly how it could be done, the timeline, and the immediate consequences. Karen's face went pale. The very rules she had weaponized against me were now the tools of her undoing. I could see the disbelief flicker across her expression, followed quickly by panic. She attempted to interrupt, to assert control, to claim I was misinterpreting the law, but it was too late. Every document I had, every timeline, every carefully noted violation of her own procedures left her with no room to maneuver. For the first time in weeks, I felt the exhilarating mix of vindication and relief. The sense of helplessness that had weighed on me for so long began to lift, replaced by a surge of empowerment. Karen, once the embodiment of authority and intimidation, was now visibly floundering. Her carefully constructed facade of control had crumbled in the face of meticulous preparation, patience, and relentless determination. Just when I thought the confrontation might end with a grudging acknowledgement on her part, she made one final desperate attempt to assert dominance. She raised her voice, accusing me of disrupting the community, of undermining her authority, of destroying the HOA from within. But her words sounded hollow, almost absurd compared to the mountain of evidence stacked before her. It was a stark, almost cinematic reversal. The homeowner, once cornered and harassed, now standing firmly in legal and moral authority, while the antagonist squirmed under the weight of her own misdeeds. I ended the meeting with a calm but firm statement. You've had your chance to enforce rules fairly. You've failed. The process to dissolve this HOA begins now, and it will be done legally, publicly, and transparently. There is no turning back." The room was heavy with silence. Karen's eyes narrowed, lips pressed together, a storm of emotions contained in a single tense posture. She knew the tide had shifted irrevocably. Outside, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Some neighbors exchanged knowing glances, others murmured quietly, and I realized that the impact of this confrontation would ripple far beyond my own property. Karen's reign, built on intimidation and selective enforcement, was over. But the story didn't end with her humiliation alone. The real victory was the precedent it set, the empowerment it delivered to anyone who had ever felt trapped by arbitrary authority. As I watched her leave, clipboard in hand but spirit visibly diminished, a mix of relief and adrenaline surged through me. Weeks of anxiety, tension, and frustration had culminated in this exact moment, the absolute turning point where the homeowner reclaimed power, dignity, and legal authority. I felt lighter, freer, almost as if the very air in the neighborhood had changed. Yet even in triumph, I knew the story wasn't completely over. Karen's reaction, the community's whispers, the legal steps still ahead, all of it would unfold in the coming days. But in that instant, standing on my porch, I understood something profound. When prepared, patient and unyielding in the face of abuse, even the most overbearing authority can be confronted and legally dismantled. The days following the confrontation felt almost surreal. For the first time in months, I woke up without that tight, gnawing tension in my chest, the one that had settled there like a permanent weight ever since the first petty fines arrived. The sun shone differently on my street, or maybe it was just my perspective that had shifted. The confrontation with Karen had been intense, exhausting, and emotionally draining, but it had also revealed something I hadn't realized before: the power of preparation, persistence, and patience in the face of seemingly insurmountable authority. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. Some neighbors whispered in disbelief. Others approached me with cautious congratulations. A few came forward to share their own stories of harassment, each revelation layering the growing realization that Karen's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was systemic. I began to understand the larger impact of what had just happened. By challenging her, I wasn't just reclaiming my property rights. I was opening the door for others who had felt powerless under the weight of arbitrary rules. Legally, the process to dissolve the HOA proceeded as I had laid out. The necessary filings, notices, and hearings followed a strict timeline, and I remained meticulous in my documentation. Every step I had taken in preparation for the confrontation now paid dividends. Each procedural requirement was met on time, each legal argument supported by evidence I had painstakingly gathered over weeks. The HOA, once a looming threat, found itself constrained by its own rules and the law, unable to retaliate without exposing itself to further legal consequences. Karen attempted to resist, of course. There were emails, attempts to rally the board, and even a few last-minute claims that certain actions couldn't be legally enforced. But her efforts were futile. Each argument she presented had already been anticipated and countered. Her veneer of control had crumbled, leaving her exposed not only to legal repercussions, but to the judgment of her own community. Watching her lose the influence she had wielded with such confidence was, in a strange way, almost poetic justice. The final vote to dissolve the HOA came faster than I had anticipated. The majority of homeowners, many of whom had quietly suffered under Karen's rules, sided with me. Their votes weren't just a procedural step. They were a collective affirmation that no single person could impose their will unfairly on an entire community. When the results were announced, there was a wave of relief, excitement, and, for some, a sense of vindication. I felt a deep, almost indescribable satisfaction in knowing that fairness had prevailed, that integrity had won, and that the oppressive influence over our neighborhood had been legally removed. But the impact went beyond paperwork and votes. I noticed subtle shifts in the atmosphere of the neighborhood almost immediately. Conversations at fences or over driveways became more open, less tense. Neighbors who had avoided interactions now stopped to greet me with smiles or even shared laughter. Children played freely, without the looming shadow of arbitrary restrictions on playground equipment or yard decor. It was a reminder that sometimes reclaiming your own space isn't just about property, it's about restoring a sense of normalcy, trust, and community. Emotionally, the transformation was just as profound. The months of stress, anxiety, and frustration had left their mark, but now I felt lighter, freer, and more confident. I realized how much strength I had drawn from persistence.